Oh, Randal, it's so enjoyable to be here with you today, and we're looking forward to sharing this wonderful story that you have. I'm seeing people start to come in now, Randal, and I know we have a wonderful group, all eager and excited to learn more about the Mayflower.
Well, I'm excited to tell the story because there's so much more to it than many of us have appreciated over the years. And particularly now with the Mayflower about to move from Mystic up the coast in the next few days or a couple of weeks' time, I think we're in for an exciting time, and perhaps some interesting things to happen and relief from the current health crisis.
Oh, absolutely. I was talking with several people yesterday, Randal, and we all have our spots picked out about where we want to be to see that ship, sail or maybe be pulled by us. But we want that spot and we're ready. Oh, it's incredible. So I think we should probably go ahead and get started looking at all the participants coming in now. We want to welcome you all to the Alden House Historic Sites presentation of the Wicked Pilgrim Mayflower to Heritage series with our speaker and author, Randal Charlton. My name is Desiree Mobed, and I'm the Executive Director of the Alden House. Together with the Alden Kindred of America's Board of Directors, we preserve and share the legacy of Mayflower passengers John and Priscilla Alden and their homestead in Duxbury, Massachusetts. With this week's news that Randal just mentioned, that Mayflower 2 will be leaving Mystic, Connecticut after several years of restoration for its voyage home to Plymouth. What an opportunity this talk is to learn more about how the ship first came into being. It was Randal's father, Warwick Charlton, an Englishman with a passion for history and a spirit of adventure, who built the replica ship as a gift to America after World War II in recognition of the close bond between our two countries that continues today. Randal will be focusing this talk on the world famous shipyard in Brixham, England, and greetings to all our friends there today, where Mayflower 2 was first built. After this presentation, we encourage you to ask questions by typing them into the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. And for those of you who have to leave early or want to share it later, a recording of this talk will be posted at the Alden website. And now, from across the pond, as they say, Randal Charlton will begin his presentation. Thank you, Randal.
Thank you, Desiree, for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be asked to follow from the talk I gave a month ago for Alden House about Mayflower 2, a ship that is shrouded in mystery, misconceptions, and I promise you more than one secret. In late May, I focused on the fact that Mayflower 2 was the gift of one man of very modest means, my father, an Englishman called Warwick Charlton. He gave Mayflower 2 to the American people in 1957 because he felt it important to thank America for their leadership in the first half of the 20th century. As he thought about what to give, what was the richest nation on earth, he decided that the thing they might value above all else was a piece of their history. So he set up a small £100 company and then built a replica of the original Mayflower and sailed it across the Atlantic, where it has been under the care of Plymouth Plantation for the last 60 plus years. And Americans have certainly treasured this gift. Over 25 million people have already visited the ship, and hopefully many more will do so after this current health crisis. But given the current challenges with international travel, I would like to take you all back on a virtual journey, back in time and across the ocean, to the birth of what is now an American treasure. Let's set the scene by taking a look at a short news clip of Mayflower 2 that was partially completed by 1956. Do we have any sound? Well, we appear to have lost the sound, but I have to tell you that video clip from Pathé News sends a shiver up my spine every time I see it. And I'll talk about what happened during that day in my talk. There are a number of remarkable things about my father's gift, but I think the most amazing are the facts at the time in 1954, when he decided to put his career as a working journalist on hold to build the ship. He had no experience whatsoever in either business or sailing, and certainly knew nothing about the challenges of building a 17th century ship. On top of that, he had no financial resources to fund his idea. He lived in rented accommodation, possessed no significant assets such as a car, and lived from one payday to another. Yet, less than 3 years later, there he was on June 13, 1957, being rowed ashore in Plymouth, Massachusetts, as thousands of Americans crowded the shore at Plymouth Harbor to greet his magnificent Mayflower 2 as she lay at anchor after a journey of almost 2 months across the Atlantic. How on earth did he accomplish this astonishing feat in such a short time? A large part of the answer is that my father was a man who, as one of his employers commented, was possessed of manic energy, unrelenting optimism, and the capacity for invention. To which I would add, he also had the courage in the face of adversity to overcome any problem. Raising the money is a story in itself, which I recount in detail in my father's biography, The Wicked Pilgrim. So was the challenge of finding a 20th century captain and crew capable of sailing a 17th century ship across the Atlantic. An epic journey that was completed by 33 men and a cat named Felix. But today, I would like to concentrate on the support my father received to answer 2 crucial questions. First, the riddle of the design of the original Mayflower, that historians believe was broken up for scrap around 1620, thereabouts. Without an answer to that, it would not have been possible to build an historically accurate replica. Secondly, at a time of great austerity in post-war Britain, there was little patience or appetite for anything other than essential activity. So how did my father find a shipbuilder with both the know-how and inclination to construct a one-off vessel that could safely sail across the Atlantic? To answer these questions, I want to introduce you all to a number of very interesting men. The head of an English museum, 2 Americans, believe it or not, one the heir to a financial house, the other as an executive of a major steel corporation. Then an English builder specialized in building fishing vessels, plus the craftsman of a small fishing village in the southwest of England, a village called Brexham. They all have 2 things in common: a love of wooden sailing ships and a passion for historical accuracy. However, before my father met many of these important contributors to the Mayflower story, he could have been forgiven for giving up before he even started. In the first challenging news, when my father made a short taxi ride across the Thames from his tiny office on an exploratory mission to Greenwich Maritime Museum. The museum director, a Dr. R.C. Anderson, an internationally respected marine historian, was both amused and intrigued when my father explained that he wanted to bring his academic research to life and actually sail a replica of the Mayflower across the Atlantic. Dr. Anderson patiently explained that no plans existed for Mayflower 2. Builders were not required to lodge them with naval authorities back in the 1500s. There were indeed ships called the Mayflower at the time, at least a dozen, which complicated the challenge of finding out which one the first settlers had commissioned. Dr. Anderson gave my father some small comfort before leaving by explaining that all cargo ships built at the time were built to a pretty standard design. And he had enough of an idea of what Mayflower looked like to produce a scale model, which he had presented to Plymouth Hall Museum in Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1931. By the way, it's still there and well worth taking a look at if you get the chance. Dr. Anderson volunteered that he'd also produced an approximate full-size design, which didn't actually sail, for a Hollywood movie about Mayflower, starring Spencer Tracy. Warwick emphasized that what was good enough for Hollywood was definitely not good enough for him. He informed the slightly bemused academic that he wanted his design to be accurate down to the inkwells in the captain's cabin. However, my father's lack of a design for the ship did not stop him placing a story in a magazine called the London Illustrated News, announcing his plans to build Mayflower 2. And as luck would have it, this weekly review of England's capital city was the favorite read of one of the last and best informed builders of wooden sailing ships in the country, a man called Stuart Upham. Stuart rushed to the local post office after reading the article and sent a telegram to my father offering to build the ship and asking to meet him immediately. My father felt that he needed to make an impression as he prepared to visit Stuart and dive into discussions on a subject in which he had still no practical knowledge and had little money to support his plan. So, to bolster his confidence and make an impression as a man of substance, he booked a flight the short 150-mile distance from London to Exeter Airport. If you look at a map, you'll find Exeter Airport down in the foot of England, for those of you not familiar with our geography. There, my father was met by Stuart Upham, and he drove him down to the shipyard in relative silence. But the two men on arrival could not contain their excitement for long. They fell upon each other with ideas and information and found they had a common desire to build a ship, not using modern tools, but tools of the late 1500s, even if that meant construction would be much slower and more expensive. And also recognizing that many of the shipyard workers might need retraining. Warwick fell in love with the fact that Stuart Upham had an enthusiasm to match his own. And importantly, Stuart and his team of craftsmen were probably one of the best builders of wooden ships in the country. Upham, of course, asked Warwick for plans on that first meeting. And remembering Dr. Anderson's model, my father wondered if that would be good enough for Stuart to work from. Well, not exactly, replied Upham, especially if you want to sail across the Atlantic and arrive safely. Stuart knew what he was talking about. His family had built wooden sailing ships in Brixham, Devon, in the southwest of England since the mid-1900s. Early on, they had specialized in schooners full of sails, designed to travel very fast to the West Indies to collect oranges and lemons that had to be delivered back to England as fresh as possible. When steamships proved faster, the Upham family shipyard turned to fishing vessels, and the Brixham fishing trawlers became famous as the best of their type in the world. These wooden boats became popular because they were nimble and easy to navigate in the nasty and tricky waters of the English Channel. And during the Second World War, the Upham Yard had built over 35 wooden minesweepers and torpedo boats, all over 100 foot long, and repaired all manner of wooden vessels that were needed for the Normandy landings at the crucial moment in World War II. Now, with the war over and the local fishing village industry in decline, Upham was building small wooden yachts for leisure and looking for a way to save his shipyard. In a sign of the instant bonding of the two men, they sealed their agreement to work together with a handshake on, guess what, July the 4th, 1955, which Warwick later noted happened to be Independence Day in America. With that, about 40 craftsmen at this small seaside town of Brixham would work 6 days a week for 2 years to build now what is an American treasure. From then on, Warwick took the less expensive and more direct train back to Brixham. Back in London, however, a solution to the design problem was waiting in the form of an offer from a young Bostonian called Harry Hornblower. Hornblower's family ran what was to become the 8th largest brokerage house in the United States. And Harry Hornblower's passion, when he was not working at the company family business, was archaeology and the study of history of Native Americans of the Plymouth area, where his family spent their summers. He wanted to establish an exhibition to recreate a living history village depicting the early days of the settlers. And he thought a copy of the Mayflower would prove an important additional attraction. So he had retained a gentleman called Mr. William Baker, a retired shipbuilding executive with Bethlehem Steel, to draw up plans for the ship. However, the best quote that Harry Hornblower could get was around $800,000, which is many millions in today's money. And this was even too much for this wealthy young man. So he agreed to give my father, William Baker's plans for the ship and retain Mr. Baker to help with advice on construction. At the same time, he agreed to provide a permanent location for the ship. Mr. Baker, a quiet, thoughtful man of few carefully chosen words, looked a slightly unusual American in the French-style beret that was his headwear of choice. He had spent his career of over 30 years designing ships as a naval architect with Bethlehem Steel in Pennsylvania. And his lifetime hobby had been the study and design of ancient sailing ships. His research on vacations had taken him to the dusty corners of museums and offices of marine records in various countries in Europe. And he'd already established the respect of marine historians internationally. In short, Mr. Baker, who was a world expert in his subject and would go on to become the founding president of the North American Society of Oceanic History. Mr. Baker's meticulous research of London shipping records had even helped him narrow down the search for the right Mayflower, a cargo ship owned by a Christopher Jones that had mysteriously carried no cargo for the year 1620, the very year that the first settlers hired from London a cargo ship to sail to the New World. Baker had studied in great detail the evolving design of ships of the period. As the designers and builders of sailing ships of the 16th century practiced an art that was handed down verbally from one craftsman to another. Then, in the 17th century, the art became more of a science, as the design for ships was reduced to mathematical formulas and drawings that were recorded on paper, drawings that William Baker studied carefully, as well as paintings in various countries, including Holland and England. Baker observed a common theme in ships of the period, which were all designed to carry cargo. They were relatively fat at the front, but tapered off towards the keel. The shape described as having the fat head of a codfish and the slim body of a mackerel. Baker's design set Upham on a search for craftsmen who could do the job, as well as train others in the forgotten art of building a ship of this design, as well as a search for the right materials. The design, as I'm sure anyone who's looked at the ship will recognize, has few straight lines, and the search was initiated throughout the West Country for suitably shaped oak trees. It was a period, remember, of post-war rationing, in which even wood was in short supply. And at one point, a stand of oaks disappeared mysteriously in the middle of the night, only to reappear in Upham's yard shortly thereafter. This appealed to my father's sense of the mischief. One giant oak was so large that the streets of Brixham had to be blocked for the best part of a day, as it was eased down the winding, narrow roads that approached the town. Other wood to make the masts came from faraway Canada, Oregon pine that was shipped across the Atlantic first to Manchester, then sent by train down to Exeter, then by road, and then finally, because it was impossible to get these 80-foot long timbers down the narrow winding roads, they were floated across the bay to Upham's yard from Torbay. William Baker and Stuart Upham conferred constantly on the details of the design. For example, the complex organization of the ropes, the so-called rat lines that the crew would climb to get to the sails, the caulking of the time that was used to seal leaks between the planking, the particular tar from Stockholm used to protect the outer surface of the ship, the nails that back then were made from wood from old cider barrels, and the need for gun ports. They were standard in the age of pirates. Another example of the emphasis both my father, Baker, and Upham placed on historical accuracy. The 37 craftsmen who worked in Upham's yard consisted of several men near the end of their careers, and they taught new apprentices the art of using old-fashioned tools, starting with the adze, which Stuart described as the most important tool in the many used in his yard. First, the keel was laid. Then, what the builders described as the ship's backbone was strengthened. Next, the magnificent ribs were added. With the skeleton in place, the thin outer planking was then applied. This, like everything else, was far from straightforward due to the constant curves of the elegant lines of the ship. Planks had to be steamed to make them pliable, then hurried to the frames where the shipwrights would bend them into position using giant clamps. If they had been allowed to cool, they would have become brittle and snapped when being bent. Finally, knocking the tree nails in to hold the planks was a job of great skill. If you mishit a wooden nail, it did not bend like metal, it shattered. Warwick also discovered a rich vein of shipbuilding knowledge that was elsewhere in the town. He visited, for example, the last remaining sailmaker in Brixham, a Mr. Harold Bridges, who started in the job at the age of 12 and had been perfecting his craft for 50 years. When Warwick entered the sail loft in an ancient building hidden behind the town's fire station, he observed that the floor of the loft was covered with rolls of old canvas, and there were chalk marks on the floor on which small boats were marked out before being cut to size. My father noticed only one concession to modern practices, a sewing machine. However, the 2,500 yards of canvas for Mayflower 2, made from flax, supplied from a company called Webster's in Arbroath, Scotland, were all stitched by hand by Mr. Bridges and a young assistant. By the way, that company donated all the canvas for the ship to Mayflower, as did many other companies. Brixham made many other contributions to the construction of Mayflower 2. Among them, the vicar of the local church, the Reverend Yeomans, held services at the shipyard and officiated at keel laying. And the chairman of the council, Mr. Bewley, donated a ship's bell that had been started in 1638 on behalf of the entire population of Brixham. And Edgar Muggeridge, one of the many local craftsmen in Upham's Yard, would sail on Mayflower 2 as the ship's carpenter. And his skills would be needed very soon after setting sail, as the inevitable leaks appeared that began to need his attention. Halfway across, after days of the searing sun and no wind, when the ship had been becalmed, a fore topsail yard split with a loud crack. After Edgar had sweated through several hours of a day to repair it, he was rewarded to see a light wind appear to breathe life into the sails. Stuart Upham, who was also a superb yachtsman, would also sail on the ship. But perhaps the biggest contribution of this little but out-of-the-way town was that it was normally focused on the business of fishing and shipbuilding, but quite prepared to submit itself to my father's plan to turn it into an instant tourist centre. Word had got out that something special was going on at Upham's Yard in Brixham, and curious visitors started turning up unannounced. Stuart Upham rang Warwick in a mild panic to point out that they were becoming a nuisance and slowing down the work. My father then exhibited his trademark skill of turning a problem into a solution. He turned the yard into a public exhibition. Now, such events were back then subject to an entertainment tax, but Warwick begged the local government for and received special exemption from this tax. He asked Henry Hornblower for a design of Pilgrim huts, had one built in a couple of weeks, then dressed his office staff in Pilgrim costumes and charged visitors a modest fee for a guided tour of the ship's construction. Visitors were then invited to sign leather-bound books expressing their goodwill to the American people. And the revenue from literally thousands of visitors who crowded the narrow streets of Brixham all went to the rapidly increasing cost of construction. It's worth noting that Warwick gave an instruction that any Americans who turned up had to be refunded their entry fee. It was, he was later to remark, probably the first time Americans had been given something for nothing while in Europe. Warwick staged 3 events at Brixham, which attracted the media from London and beyond. The first was the key laying. He identified a descendant of one of the original settlers, a retired military man, Commander Winslow, to conduct the ceremony, and Warwick persuaded the local military band to provide the music and the local church to provide the blessing, to what Warwick described as nothing more than a lonely stick. A year later, my father decided on a true American hero, a man called Rhys Lemming, to launch the partially finished Mayflower. Rhys Lemming, who had been stationed in the UK with the US military, had a few years earlier saved the lives of 27 English people in a major flood in the east of England. Mr. Lemming could not swim at the time, and he brought off his courageous action in a survival vest before collapsing with exhaustion and hypothermia. He was awarded the George Medal, Britain's highest honour, shortly thereafter. My father had him tracked down back in America, and Rhys Lemming and his wife were flown over to officiate at an ancient ceremony conducted in a thunderstorm so intense that almost nobody could hear the speeches as the rain built down on the galvanized roof of the shipyard. As you will have seen in that grainy film shot, the ship was actually not completely finished. It was moved into dry dock after launching at Upham's Yard for the final decking and mast to be added. And when all this work was complete, the ship was put back in the water on, of all days, All Fool's Day, April the 1st, 1957. This event tested the nerves of a large crowd and the assembled media. The drama would occur when the finished ship was released from dry dock. It rocked and rolled and lumbered across the harbour and then came to a halt, listing over at an alarming angle of over 30 degrees. For a moment, both locals and visitors held their breath as it looked as though Mayflower might topple and sink into the harbour. William Baker, a man of few words, even in a crisis, apparently muttered calmly, "Not enough ballast," a fault that was swiftly corrected with several tons of railway iron. The assembled press, however, seized on the scare to report the incident, and one writer with sailing expertise gave Mayflower only a 50-50 chance of making it across the Atlantic. Over 60 years later, Mayflower II, the last major ship that was built by Brixham's craftsmen and with the support of the Devonshire coastal town, is still safely at anchor in American shores. She, as many of you know, underwent a major refit by the equally skilled craftsmen at Mystic Seaport, a whole nother story, and it's now ready to excite visitors for a generation or more. This year, Brixham was hoping to see many American visitors. Upham's Yard has closed long ago, but the beautiful seaside town retains its strong attraction, and you can still rent a couple of Upham's leisure yachts. Brixham Museum is now the place for Americans seeking more information on the town's important role in the Mayflower adventure. It's a small museum staffed by volunteers and described by one local as an old-fashioned museum dedicated to telling the story of the amazing achievements of the townspeople, both on water and land. They have several important items, in particular, the complete plans that were used to build Mayflower 2. And in 2013, the museum won an award from the prestigious Daily Telegraph for the best children's museum in the country. And the Berry Head Hotel and the Quayside Hotel will both be ready to welcome travelers when they resume their search for a close-up look at the Mayflower story. Brixham's role in my father's Mayflower adventure is described in a wonderful new book titled Brixham's Mayflower by local resident John Scotney. Those seeking more details of the construction of Mayflower 2 will, I'm sure, find exactly what they're looking for in John's account, as well as a colourful account of Brixham characters who took on what one craftsman described as the job of a lifetime. And as John Scotney explains, the town that still cherishes its role as a working town, and even today claims to be an important village, is actually the most prosperous fishing village in England at this moment. In conclusion, I think it's worth noting that Mayflower 2 has its own story to tell, which is very different from the first Mayflower story, the one that sailed in 1620. The second Mayflower was, I hope I've demonstrated, at its core, an Anglo-American collaboration, a brilliant partnership between an American naval architect, an American archaeologist, an English marine historian, a world-class English shipbuilder, and a team of 37 highly skilled Brixham craftsmen, all driven, of course, by my father, a man possessed of manic energy, a passion for history, and an admiration for America's contribution to peace and democracy in the 20th century. Thank you.
Oh, Randal, that was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. I think what we'd like to do now is to get your questions. If you want to ask them, go ahead and use that Q&A button, please, at the bottom of your screen, and we can share them with everyone. So we'll go ahead and, okay. I don't know what to do. Oh, so, yep, we'll go ahead and, oh, I see some questions coming in. So we'll go ahead and keep going. So we have lots of appreciation for this story, Randal. And I think our video may be off a second, so we'll give it time to catch up. I think the computer froze, so we'll go ahead and get started momentarily. Yep. So do you see, if you want to go ahead, Randal, and look into the Q&A button, there you go. I have a question for you that one of the ones that has been shared with us is, since we know that the Mayflower 2 has just recently been restored, what do you think that the Brixham shipyard guys would have thought of what's been done today?
I think they would have loved it. I know that the chairman of Brixham Museum and his wife came across when there was the relaunching of Mayflower 2 at Mystic, and they brought across some Brixham water to bless the ship. And I was lucky enough to be there when that was carried out. And I think I noticed when I was at Mystic the enormous enthusiasm of the 21st century shipwrights at Mystic, which mirrored what my father described as the atmosphere whenever he went down to Brixham. There was a love and a passion in what they're doing. And they all found the ship, the only word I can use is alluring. I saw a quote of one of the original shipwrights, this Devonian called Edgar Muggeridge, who sailed on the ship. And at one point, he was next to my father, and he was looking, he was looking around, and he said, and forgive me, I'm not very good on my Devonshire accent, she's a real beauty, she is.
Yes. It's that passion for the work, I think.
Exactly.
There's another, and the history of it, which, you know, and the details, it's just phenomenal. So another question that has come in is, what do you think Warwick would like the future of Mayflower to be? And how is it relevant to young people today? It's a very interesting question.
It is indeed. Warwick said when he handed over the ship in the telegram, and forgive me, I don't know, I can't recall the exact words, but it was something like, we are two nations separated by an ocean that can never keep us apart. He believed that both America and the United States shared a lot of common values, particularly a love of democracy and freedom. I think he would love to see the ship used not just to tell the story of the first sailing, which is important, very important, it's core, but also to explore ways in which the ship could be a focus for Anglo-American exchange scholarships for young people, with Americans coming over to England and vice versa. And if I can just mention that I set up a small foundation recently to encourage that. And last year, a PhD student from the University of Plymouth went across to Plymouth in the United States to study Native American social practice. And I would love to see, and I think my father certainly would have loved to have seen, a fund set up in some way associated with Mayflower to develop exchange scholarships.
Yeah, to share that. I think that's a really important thing. One of the things that we've heard is just the challenges also, just, you know, the loss of understanding how so much of those things were done too. So, even on the more practical side, wonderful skills that can be shared and developed on both sides. Another question that we have is, this is always intriguing about secrets. You mentioned the Mayflower 2 contains some secrets. So can you illuminate us on that?
Well, yes, I can. I'll give you one, and that is that the ashes of one man were scattered in the ship in a commemoration of his life back in 2003. So, if you like, Mayflower 2 is a gently resting graveyard for one person. That person was my father. After funeral service in England, the family were invited by the folks at Plymouth Plantation to go over in May of 2003. And we all went over, and his ashes were brought over, and they were given to the interpreters who scattered them in the ship. And I think that's about as fitting a resting place as you could give a man who had given the ship to the American people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to get that done in the short amount of time that he did too is just awing. It was a feat that just took so much drive and energy. I don't know, what were sort of your family's reactions to some of this while it was going on? Of course, you were young, but you were certainly aware of it. Yeah.
I was a teenager. My father was, to put it mildly, was obsessed with the project and making it work. And there were all kinds of obstacles presented. What today I've tried to focus on is a lot of the absolutely brilliant support that he got, without which it wouldn't have been possible. From Anderson at the Greenwich Museum, William Baker, Henry Hornblower, Stuart Upham. All of those provided enormous positive support. At the time, the British government was not desperately keen on the project, has been noted in independent research. They thought that post-war, that Britain should be presenting an image of high technology in order to interest American customers and business. And it was only at the last when they saw how much everybody fell for Mayflower 2 that they came round to support it. My father also had the problem that just when he thought everything was going well and the ship would be ready to sail on time, and he was about to launch a public appeal for funds to finish off the ship, Britain got involved in a war in the Suez in Egypt in 1956. And the British government had failed to inform their principal friend, President Eisenhower in the United States, who was at that time trying to explain to other countries around the world not to get involved in other countries' business. Eisenhower was furious and demanded that the British, who had conspired with the French and the Israelis, to go on this invasion of Egypt, to withdraw immediately, which they pretty much did. But that didn't, how can I put it? persuade the British public that they should be giving a gift to the Americans. The Americans were much more sanguine about it. They were much more relaxed. In the end, Mayflower 2 and its sailing was credited by many commentators with helping to heal the wounds that had been opened with, you know, the, how can I put it, poor politics of 1956.
So another question that's come in is, what would Warwick have thought of the new captain, Whit Perry?
Oh, he would have loved him. Yeah, he's a great man. You know, Warwick described the first captain, Captain Villiers, who was probably one of the best sailors of tall ships in the world at the time, as having the air of, when he went into a room, bringing the sea with him. And Walt gives you that impression, you know, when you meet him. Even us landlubbers, and I count myself as one, you get an immediate impression of someone who both loves the sea and regards Mayflower as the best ship he could possibly have to sail.
So in addition to Brixham, what other towns in England would you recommend to Americans once we can all travel again, interested in tracing?
Right, which we all hope is soon. Well, there are about 11 on the Mayflower Heritage Trail, but if I can mention just a few of them, certainly Gainsborough is one to go to in North Lincolnshire, where they're actually holding a exhibit, a first exhibition of the Mayflower 2 story. And there's also a lot of other interesting artifacts and history to Gainsborough, particularly for those who are interested in agriculture. And of course, the Pilgrim story is an integral part of that area. Nearby Bassetlaw has a wonderful small museum as well. And there is Scrooby and Babworth there. So there's a little area north of London, which you can access by fast train, which has a lot of history related to the first Mayflower. And then in the south, of course, you've got London at Greenwich Museum, Southampton, Brixham, which we've just focused on, then Dartmouth, which is a fascinating place to visit, and Plymouth, of course, where they have a new museum called The Box. And I'd recommend anybody to go and take a, that hasn't been to Plymouth, to make sure they include a visit to the Box Museum, which is right close to the University of Plymouth, if they go there.
So do you have plans to go to Plymouth and see Mayflower 2 in anytime soon? Come back?
Yeah, subject to all our travel restrictions. You know, I have to say, I was looking forward to following the Mayflower from Mystic up to Newport, Rhode Island, and then into Boston, and then down to Plymouth and Provincetown, of course, this spring. But of course, that was cancelled, and myself and my wife were literally stuck here in the UK. But you know, I hope to renew my acquaintance with the Mayflower stop-offs in the United States sooner rather than later.
Yes, absolutely. Now, we haven't really talked so much about your book. If you want to go ahead and just touch on that a little bit more, and obviously this is based on it, but just a little bit more
Sure.
detail.
Yeah, the book is the biography of my father, explaining who he was and why he decided to build the Mayflower, which was, among many others very interesting things he did in his life, he always described as the single most important thing. I go into some detail about his role in the war when he was on the staff of General Montgomery, the British general in the North African desert. And it was there that he got to see and become impressed with the enormous support that first President Roosevelt and then individual Americans gave even before they entered the war formally. And he was in no doubt that the outcome of the war could have been very different without American support. I then trace his time where he served under Lord Mountbatten in India before coming back to England, where he was a well-known English journalist working on Fleet Street. He spent time with a program in the BBC called Meet the People, because he believed that the new front line post-war was actually in the factories of England. And so every week his program would go out and interview ordinary Englishmen trying to put their country back on its feet. And he was 100% liberal, I have to say, in the sense that he believed in the power of the ordinary man and woman, and witnessed the fact that at the keel laying of Mayflower 2 and the launch, he did not call on a great admiral or member of the government to do the honors. He went for an ordinary American soldier in one case, who exhibited incredible bravery, and in another, an older gentleman who traced his ancestry back to the original Mayflower and understood the importance of it. And everything from the Mayflower Compact to the history of the early settlers. So, and then I discuss his life post Mayflower, which was also interesting because he spent 2 years lecture touring around America. And, just to give you one example, he gave a lecture at one point to a group of students who were not from Europe initially. And one of them said, well, what's this ship got to do with me? And, Warwick described, how important it was that people who had fought together lived together. And he demonstrated that in his life. He was very much ahead of his times. And I think the book, although at the end of his life, he held a modest, the only elective office he held was as the town crier in the small town of Ringwood on the south coast. The reason he went for that was he liked dressing up, and there was a uniform to go with it. But more importantly, he understood that town criers were the original dispensers of news. They would walk through the streets of towns crying it's, 7 o'clock and all's well, or whatever the news of the time was. So he was also a passionate journalist. So anyone interested in communication, I think, would also find the book of interest.
So we're approaching our hour mark here, but just real quickly, just one more thing about the title of the book and what that Wicked Pilgrim means. Well,
it was when I interviewed my father back, I started interviewing him back in 1994 for the book. He described himself as a bit of a wicked pilgrim. I said, Dad, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, I had to sail fairly close to the wind at times in order to get my project done. That meant that he had to be a shameless publicist, which he was, about the ship, to the point where, some people thought he was economical with the truth. I'll give you one example. National Geographic agreed to carry a story, or several stories, as it turned out, about Mayflower at the time. And Life magazine also offered £1,000 for the exclusive rights to photograph the ship as it went across the ocean, and they sent a photographer and journalist on the ship. My father put out a story denying the fact that Life magazine had paid £10,000. It was an attempt to convince everybody concerned that he had enough money to keep the whole project going, when underneath he was desperately trying to figure out new ways to raise money, such as he published a magazine called Mayflower Mail, he produced Mayflower ties, he had Mayflower medallions, he had a special Mayflower stamp issued. He did all manner of things designed during those 2 years to keep the money flowing, to keep the work going down in Brixham. And without going into further detail, he admitted that sometimes, as he put it, he sailed close to the wind.
But look at what he has given to the world, and it lives on and continues, and will be back home in Plymouth before the summer's out. So any last words you'd like to share, Randal, as we close this program?
Well, just that there's a lot more to the story, and I would love to continue telling that story. For example, I didn't mention at all the actual voyage, which is covered with fascinating drama, great salesmanship, a lot of fun, and believe it or not, people from various backgrounds and nationalities were on that vessel. Then there's the contribution of some of the English towns, which I'd love to share with you. I mentioned Gainsborough and Bassetlaw, Dartmouth. So for those of you who have found this mildly interesting, I've got a lot more to tell you if you're interested.
Oh, thank you, Randal. We will look forward to that. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Again, this was sponsored by the Alden Kindred of America. Alden House is open now to the public for tours. Please visit us at alden.org. We will be posting this webinar on the website in the next few days. Thank you all again.
Thank you.